She kept saying, "Daddy's angels." And I didn't even know if angels were real, but she believed it. So I walked. A teenage boy soaked barefoot in one broken boot, barely breathing, collapses against a steel door in the middle of a Montana blizzard, clutching a 2-year-old child against his chest, like she is the only thing tethered to this world worth saving. He doesn't knock. He doesn't have the strength. He just falls. And somehow the door opens. The night Gideon Hayes nearly died, he wasn't thinking about himself. That detail matters. It matters because Gideon Hayes was 17 years old, homeless, and had been sleeping behind a hospital dumpster for 11 days when the temperature dropped to 9 degrees and the sleet started coming down sideways. He had $243 in his jacket pocket, a broken zipper on his left boot, and exactly 0 reasons by any rational calculation to do what he did next. But rationality left the equation the moment he heard the crying. It wasn't loud. That's the thing nobody understands when they hear the story later. It wasn't a screaming, wailing, impossible to ignore kind of crying. It was small, wet, exhausted, the kind of sound a child makes when they've already been crying for so long that they don't have anything left when the sound itself starts to give up. Gideon heard it from 20 feet away, cutting through the wind like a needle through fabric. He stopped walking. He told himself later that he almost didn't, that there was a version of that night where he kept moving, where he pulled his hood tighter and told himself it wasn't his problem, that someone else would come, that the world had enough people who didn't help him, and maybe that was just how things worked. He almost talked himself into walking away. Almost. But he turned around, and there she was. A little girl couldn't have been more than 2 years old, sitting on the wet concrete at the edge of the hospital's side entrance, under an overhang that wasn't doing much against the blowing sleet, wrapped in a pink fleece blanket that was already soaked through. She had curly dark hair plastered flat against her forehead. She was wearing one shoe. Next to her, a man was down. Not sitting, not resting, down. Face first, one arm stretched out, fingers still loosely curled around the edge of the child's blanket, like he'd been holding on until the very last possible second, and his body just stopped cooperating. Gideon ran. He didn't decide to run. His legs just moved. He crossed the distance between them in seconds and dropped to his knees on the wet pavement beside the man, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck, the way he'd seen someone do in a movie once, and praying to God it worked the same in real life. Pulse, weak, but there. "Hey!" Gideon shook the man's shoulder. "Hey, wake up. Sir, wake up. You need to wake up right now." The man groaned. His eyes cracked open, dark brown, glassy, struggling to focus. He looked at Gideon with the kind of expression that people wear when they're trying to remember where they are and none of the answers feel right. The man started. Then he coughed hard, the kind of cough that comes from somewhere deep and wrong. "Your daughter, she's right here," Gideon said quickly. "She's okay, I got her. She's..." He looked at the little girl who had stopped crying and was now staring at him with enormous brown eyes, her tiny chin still trembling. "She's right here. What happened to you? Are you sick?" The man tried to push himself up. Failed. His arm buckled and Gideon caught him by the shoulder, keeping him from going face down again. "Called for help," the man rasped. "Already called. They're coming." But another cough, worse this time. "She can't wait here. Too cold. She can't..." "She won't," Gideon said. He didn't even think about it. "I'll stay with her." The man squinted at him, really looked at him for the first time, took in the soaked hoodie, the broken boot, the hollow-cheeked face of a kid who hadn't eaten a real meal in days. "You don't even know us," the man said. "No," Gideon agreed. "But you're down and she's 2 years old and it's 9 degrees. We can sort out the rest later." Something moved across the man's face. Something that looked for just a moment like the specific grief of someone who has been let down by too many people and doesn't know what to do when someone actually shows up. "Find the angels," the man said. Gideon blinked. "What?" "When help comes, if I can't..." Another cough tore through him, and this time it lasted longer, and when it stopped, the man's face was gray. "Tell them Cade sent you. The angels. She knows. Ren knows. She'll say it." He reached out and gripped Gideon's wrist with fingers that were cold as stone. "She knows where. She'll say it. Don't let her be alone." "I won't," Gideon said. "I promise I won't." "Don't leave her." "I won't leave her." The man's hand went slack. Gideon's mind was already working through the calculations the way it had been working through calculations for 11 days straight, the way it worked when you didn't have the luxury of stopping to feel things, because feeling things meant slowing down, and slowing down meant the cold got in deeper. He looked at the little girl, Wren. That's what the man had called her. She was shivering. Not violently, but steadily, the kind of shiver that tells you the body is losing the fight and doesn't know how to stop it. Gideon pulled off his jacket. It was the only real layer he had, the only thing between him and the wind, and the rational part of his brain screamed at him that this was a bad idea, that he needed that jacket, that giving it away meant he was choosing to freeze. But Wren was 2 years old, and he had made a promise. He wrapped the jacket around her, pulled it tight, zipped it as far as it would go. She looked up at him with those enormous eyes and said very quietly, "Cold." "I know," Gideon said. "I know, sweetheart. But you're going to be okay. You hear me? You're going to be okay." The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. Gideon watched them load the man onto a stretcher, watched the paramedics move with the specific controlled urgency of people who know that every second counts and can't afford to panic. One of them glanced at Gideon, looked at the child in his arms, because somehow Wren had ended up in his arms, had crawled there on her own while he was talking to her father. "You family?" the paramedic asked. "No," Gideon said. "Then we need to contact." "He said she can't be alone," Gideon said. "He told me. Her name is Wren. Her dad's name is Cade. He said she needs to go where the angels are, and she knows where." The paramedic looked at him for a long second, the kind of look that people give you when they're trying to decide if you're a problem or a solution. Then the ambulance doors were closing, and there was another paramedic asking him something about the hospital's family services department and whether the child had other family. And somewhere in all of that, the question of what happened to Gideon, where he would sleep, how he would survive, got completely lost in the shuffle, which was honestly how it always went. He ended up sitting on a plastic chair in the hospital's waiting area with Wren in his lap for 45 minutes, while a tired-looking woman from social services made phone calls and filled up weird, odd-out paperwork and kept glancing at the two of them with an expression that Gideon had learned to read fluently, the expression of someone calculating exactly how much this is going to cost the system. During those 45 minutes, Wren said about 11 words total. She said cold twice and shoe once while looking at her barefoot with mild concern, and juice with a hopefulness that broke Gideon's heart because he had nothing to give her. She fell asleep for a while against his shoulder, her small fist wrapped around the drawstring of his hoodie, and Gideon sat very still and didn't move in case moving would wake her. And then the social services woman came back and said, "We're having trouble reaching next of kin. The father's in surgery. We're going to need to place her temporarily with—" "No," Wren said. Both of them looked down at her. She was awake, apparently, and watching the woman with calm, absolute seriousness. "No, she said again, then with great deliberateness, "Daddy's angels." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry." "Daddy's angels," Wren repeated. She turned and looked up at Gideon. "Angels." Gideon stared at her, thought about what Kate had said. "Find the angels. She knows where." "Wren," he said carefully, "where are Daddy's angels?" She pointed. He followed her finger. She was pointing at the window, at the street outside, at the dark and the snow and the nothing that Gideon could see past the glass, which told him exactly nothing useful. But then Wren said one more word, and that one word changed everything. She said road. Gideon was on his feet before he had a fully formed thought. Wren balanced on his hip, already moving toward the exit. The social services woman said something behind him, something about procedure, about authorization, about waiting, and he turned back just long enough to say, "I made him a promise. I'm not breaking it." And then he walked out the door into the storm. What Gideon knew about rural Montana could be written on a napkin. He'd come through 3 weeks ago with his mother on what was supposed to be a temporary relocation following a job lead or a cousin or some combination of hope and desperation that had collapsed as these things do on contact with reality. He knew the hospital, he knew the dumpster behind it, he knew the gas station 2 blocks east, where the overnight guy sometimes let him fill his water bottle without hassle. He did not know where the angels were, but Wren seemed to. She was shockingly calm for a 2-year-old being carried through a blizzard by a stranger. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. She tucked her face against the side of his neck, and every time he stopped at an intersection, every time he hesitated, She would lift her head and point. Left, straight, left again. Are you sure? He asked her at one point, standing at a crossroads with nothing visible in any direction except dark and white and the specific violence of Montana winter closing in from all sides. You sure this is right? She patted his cheek with one small hand. Angels, she said confidently. He kept walking. The first mile wasn't so bad. Cold, yes, the sleet was coming in sheets, hitting him in the face like thrown gravel, and his broken boot was already soaked through, and his toes had gone from painful to numb in a way that he told himself was fine, was okay, was manageable. He tucked Ren deeper inside his hoodie, the only layer he had left now that she was wearing his jacket, and kept her face pressed against his chest so she wasn't breathing the wind directly. She was warmer than he was. He made sure of that. Every time he felt her shiver, he wrapped his arms tighter around her and rubbed her back through the jacket and said things like almost there. Even when he had no idea if that was true. By the second mile, his legs were starting to feel heavy. Not the normal tired heavy of someone who's been on their feet all day. The specific weighted, treacherous heavy of cold that is getting into the muscles and slowing them down from the inside. He knew what that meant. He knew in the abstract, clinical way that someone picks up knowledge from years of surviving, things they shouldn't have to survive, that this was the beginning of something dangerous. He kept walking. Talk to me, he told Ren. Keep talking to me. Okay, tell me about your daddy. Daddy big, she said. Yeah, how big? She spread her arms as wide as they would go, which was not very wide because she was wrapped inside his hoodie, but the intent was clear. Very big. Huh? That's good. What else? Daddy loud, she said, and something in her voice, some small, fond note of long familiarity, made his chest ache. Loud like loud mad or loud happy. She considered this. Loud happy, she decided. Good, he said. Loud happy is good. What does Daddy sound like when he's loud happy? She made a sound, a rumbling, exaggerated hey that was so clearly meant to be an impression of someone specific and enormous and beloved that Gideon laughed despite everything, despite the cold and the dark and the weight of his soaked boot and the fear he was keeping carefully behind his teeth. He sounds like a bear, Gideon said. Bear, Ren agreed happily. Okay, so we're going to find Daddy's angels, and we're going to tell them Daddy's a bear, and they're going to know exactly who we mean. Deal. Deal, she said with great confidence and pointed left. He turned to left. By the third mile, Gideon stopped being able to feel his feet, not numb, not the tolerable absence of sensation he'd managed through the first couple miles. This was the kind of not feeling that announces itself with a specific dread that makes a person realize they have crossed some threshold they can't easily uncross. He looked down at his boots, at the snow packed into the broken seam of the left one, and thought with a strange, distant clarity, this is actually serious now. He'd been in bad situations before. He'd been cold before. He'd been hungry and exhausted and invisible to a world that kept walking past him, like he was part of the scenery, like he was just a detail in the background of everyone else's more important lives. But this was different. His legs were moving slower. His thoughts were starting to come at him from further away like radio signals losing their station. He knew what this was. He'd read about it once in a library on a day when the cold outside was just regular Montana winter cold, and he'd been warm enough to read without his hands shaking. Hypothermia started with shivering, then it stopped you from shivering. And then right about the time your brain started telling you that everything was actually fine and you were very warm and you could sit down for just a minute, that's when it was really over. He wasn't there yet, but he could feel the edges of it. Ren, he said. His voice came out slower than he intended. Ren, how far? She lifted her head, looked around. For a moment, her face did something complicated, a toddler's processing of distance and direction, working from some internal map that he hoped to God was accurate. And then she pointed straight ahead. Close, she said. How close? Daddy's angels, she said more firmly, as if this was the most precise measurement available, and he should simply accept it. Right, he said. Okay. He adjusted her weight against his chest. His arms were aching, not painfully, numbly, distantly, the way things ache when the cold has gotten deep enough to dampen everything. You stay warm. You hear me? You stay inside the hoodie. Whatever happens, you stay warm. She looked up at him from inside the fabric with those enormous dark eyes, serious in the way very young children sometimes are. That unsettling ancient seriousness, like they understand more than they're supposed to. You cold? She asked. I'm fine, he said. You cold? She said. Not a question this time. He didn't answer. She reached up with her tiny cold hand and pressed it against his cheek the way she'd done at the crossroads. Except this time she held it there, and it wasn't a direction. It was something else. Something that a 2-year-old shouldn't know how to do, but apparently did. Angels come, she said softly. Angels come. He kept walking. Mile 4, mile 5. He lost track of the time. He knew it was late past midnight, maybe past 1 in the morning, because the streets were empty and the dark felt absolute, and the storm hadn't let up even slightly. If anything, it was worse. He was walking with his head down, just watching the ground in front of his feet, because he couldn't look into the sleet anymore without his eyes watering shut. He was counting steps for a while, sets of 100, then sets of 50, then just one at a time. Left foot, left, right. He didn't let himself think past the next step. At some point, he started talking to Wren even though she'd fallen asleep again against his chest. Talking low and continuous and probably nonsensical, telling her about the library where he used to go before everything fell apart, about the librarian who let him stay past closing, sometimes when the weather was bad, about his mother's laugh, which was the best sound he'd ever heard, and which he was holding on to with both hands in the back of his mind like something precious that could still be salvaged. He talked because the sound of his own voice was the only thing keeping him tethered, and then through the dark and the white and the roaring of the wind light, not a street light, not a porch light, the warm, spilled golden light of windows, multiple windows, a building, a low, long building set back from the road with bikes parked out front, even in the snow, covered in ice, but unmistakably there. And above the door, visible even through the storm, a spray-painted mural of wings. He stopped. He stared at it. He laughed, or tried to. What came out was something between a laugh and a sound he couldn't quite name. Something that was also tears, though he wouldn't have said so. Wings, he told Wren's sleeping face. Wings, Wren, look. She didn't look. She was asleep. Okay, he said. That's okay. I'll tell you about it later. He made it to the door. He raised his hand to knock and discovered that he could no longer make a fist. His fingers wouldn't close all the way, and the ones that did close did it with the kind of slow, distant cooperation of things that have stopped being fully his. He looked at his hand for a long moment, studying this, and thought, that's not great. He hit the door with his palm instead. Once, twice. He didn't have the strength for 3. He heard voices on the other side, the thump of boots on a floor. Someone saying something, a question, a response, a brief, sharp exchange. Then the sound of a lock. The door swung open. Light and heat poured out of it like something physical, and Gideon felt the warmth hit his face and thought with perfect clarity, I made it. We made it. Then the man in the doorway said something. Or maybe several men said something. There was a lot of noise suddenly, or maybe it was the same amount of noise, but his brain was struggling to process it. He was aware of faces. Big, bearded, weathered faces wearing expressions that shifted rapidly from suspicion to shock. He was aware of someone reaching for Wren. He stepped back. Automatic. Animal. No, he said. The word came out thick and strange, but definite. Not she needs. He stopped, started again, focused with everything he had. Her dad, Cade. He said, find the angels. She said, wings. I walked. She said, wings, and I walked, and he looked down at his feet. I can't. Somebody catch him, someone said very clearly from somewhere above him. And then the ground came up. And Gideon Hayes, who had walked 6 miles through a Montana blizzard carrying a child who wasn't his for a father he'd known for 4 minutes, went down on the threshold of the place he'd been promised was safe, and for the first time in 11 days, let himself stop. The last thing he heard before the dark took him was Wren. She had woken up. She was in someone else's arms now. Warm arms, big arms, the arms of someone who had rushed forward and scooped her up before she could fall with him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't scared. She was looking around at the room full of bikers with an expression of absolute recognition. The expression of a child who has arrived exactly where she expected to be. Angels, she said with tremendous satisfaction. And then the door closed against the storm, and the heat closed around them both. The warmth hit him before consciousness did. Gideon came back to the world in pieces. First the heat pressing in from all sides like something he hadn't earned. Then the sound of voices, low and urgent. Then the specific discomfort of feeling returning to his fingers, which announced itself not as relief, but as pure white-hot pain that made him gasp before he was even fully awake. There he is, someone said. He opened his eyes. He was on something soft, a couch, wide and worn, the kind that had absorbed 10,000 hours of human weight and shaped itself accordingly. Above him, three faces. Big men, bearded, rough-edged, wearing cuts the leather vests he'd registered dimly at the door before the floor came up to meet him. They were looking at him with expressions that were hard to read, something between concern and assessment. The way men look at a situation they're still deciding how to classify. Don't try to sit up, the closest one said. He was maybe 40, dark-skinned, with a shaved head and a jaw like a shelf. His patch said Garrett. Doc's checking your hands. Gideon looked down. There was an older man crouched at the end of the couch, white-haired, methodical, working through Gideon's fingers one at a time with the focused calm of someone who has done this before. He pressed on the tip of Gideon's index finger, and Gideon hissed through his teeth. Good, the old man said without looking up. Pain is good. Pain means it's still yours. Ren, Gideon said. The word came out raw. She's fine. This from a different voice across the room. Quieter. Gideon turned his head and saw her. Ren was sitting on the bar of all places, wrapped in what looked like a flannel shirt turned into a makeshift blanket, eating crackers from someone's hand with total focused intensity that toddlers bring to snacks. She looked warm. She looked completely unconcerned. She looked, if he was honest, like she owned the place. Gideon exhaled. The breath came out shakier than he expected. Okay, he said. Okay, good. What's your name, son? The man called Garrett again. Not aggressive, careful. Gideon, he said. Gideon Hayes. How old are you? He's 17. The men exchanged a look over his head, the kind of look that carries an entire conversation in a fraction of a second. Where are your parents? And there it was, the question that always came, the question with no good answer, the question that turned him from a person into a situation. He felt the familiar closing off instinct rise in his chest, the learned reflex of someone who has been processed by enough systems to know that the truth rarely helps you. But he was too cold and too tired and too far past pretending. My mom's at the shelter on 5th, he said. She's sick. I've been trying to figure out a better arrangement. Silence. Then Garrett said very evenly, You've been on the streets. 11 days, Gideon said, give or take. Another look traded over his head, this one longer. Tell me about the girl, said a new voice. Gideon pushed himself up on one elbow, despite the old man's protest, and got his first real look at the person who had spoken. He was standing at the edge of the room, not hovering like the others, but positioned with the deliberate stillness of a man who doesn't move unless he means to. 50, maybe. Heavy through the shoulders. The kind of build that wasn't gym built but work built. Years of actual use. Gray in his beard, in his close-cropped hair. His eyes were dark and absolutely steady, and they were fixed on Gideon with the specific, undivided attention of someone who was weighing every word before it was spoken. His patch said president, below that one-word stone. Tell me, he said again, from the beginning, don't skip anything. So Gideon told him. He told him about the crying he'd almost walked past, about Cade the man down on the wet concrete, the cough that came from somewhere wrong, the fingers loose around the blanket's edge. He told him about the 4 minutes in the hospital parking lot, the ambulance, the social services woman, with her clipboard and her calculations. He told him about Ren pointing at the window at the road. He told him about finding the angels in the wings above the door, and 6 miles through a storm he wasn't sure he was going to survive. He told it flat, no performance, no bid for sympathy. He was too exhausted for that. He just said what happened in the order it had happened and let the men in the room do whatever they were going to do with it. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Stone said very carefully, What was his name, the man outside the hospital? Cade, Gideon said. He said, tell them Cade sent you. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Heavier. It had a texture to it, a weight that Gideon didn't understand yet, but could feel the way you can feel a storm system changing pressure before the rain actually comes. Garrett turned away, pressed both hands flat on the bar. His head dropped. Someone in the back of the room said very quietly, "God." Stone didn't move. His eyes stayed on Gideon, but whatever he was seeing wasn't just Gideon anymore. He was somewhere else behind those eyes, running through something calculating, absorbing. "Cade Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know his last name," Gideon said. "Dark hair, dark eyes, big, yeah, beard, scar on his left jaw." It was dark. I didn't see a scar. Big man would have been wearing a canvas jacket, dark green. Gideon thought back. The cold concrete, the outstretched hand, the canvas of the sleeve against his fingers when he'd gripped the man's shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, dark green." Stone closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at Garrett and said, "Call the hospital." Garrett was already moving. "Wait," Gideon said. He pushed himself all the way up, now ignoring the old man's objections and the complaint from his own legs, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees. "Who is he, Cade? Who is he to you?" Stone looked at him for a moment, measuring something. "He's our brother," he said. That word, not used casually, not metaphorical in the way civilians sometimes said it, but weighted with the specific gravity of men who have made real commitments to each other. It landed in the room and changed the air. "He's been gone 3 months, Stone said. Left to deal with some personal business. We knew he had Ren with him. We've been trying to reach him for 2 weeks. He paused. "We thought he was just off-grid." "He wasn't off-grid," Gideon said. "He was sick. He's been sick for a while, I think. The way he went down, that wasn't sudden. That was someone who'd been fighting something for a long time and finally lost the argument." Stone absorbed this without expression, but something moved behind his eyes. Something old and carefully managed. Across the room, Garrett had someone on the phone. His voice was low and rapid. Name, physical description, approximate time of arrival. "He's one of ours," Garrett said into the phone, and the men around him were listening with the focused quiet of people who know that the next 30 seconds might tell them something they're not ready to hear. Gideon watched Ren. She had finished her crackers and was now apparently conducting a detailed examination of the zipper on the flannel shirt she was wrapped in, pulling it up and down with intense concentration, utterly unbothered by the tension moving through the room around her like a current. Every few seconds she would look up, scan the room, find Gideon's face and look back down satisfied, as if she was checking that he was still there and finding this satisfactory data. It did something to him every time she did it. He didn't know how to name what it did. "She talked to you," Stone said. He'd moved closer without Gideon noticing. The man moved quietly for his size, the whole way here. "Yeah," Gideon said. "What did she say?" "She gave me directions," Gideon said. "And she told me about her dad. Said he was big. Said he was loud, happy." He paused. "She did an impression of him, sounded like a bear." Something shifted in Stone's face. The controlled mask slipped. Not all the way, barely at all, but enough. A muscle moved at the corner of his jaw. His eyes dropped to Ren for a moment, and what was in them when he looked at her was so unguarded that Gideon felt like he was seeing something he hadn't been meant to see. Then Garrett said from across the room, "He's in surgery." Every head turned. "They've got him. He's in surgery. Cardiac event they think complicated by pneumonia." They said. Garrett stopped, pressed the phone harder against his ear. "Yeah, I'm here." A pause. "What?" Another pause. Longer. His jaw tightened. Okay, we'll be there." He lowered the phone. "He's critical," he said. They can't say yet." The room absorbed this the way a room full of people absorbs bad news when they've had practice at it. Not with keening, not with noise, but with a dense pressing silence that had its own kind of weight. Men looked at each other. Someone's hand came down on someone else's shoulder. Small gestures, precise and private. Stone turned back to Gideon. "You need to stay here," he said. "Doc needs to finish with your hands, and you're not in any shape to go anywhere." "I understand." "Do you?" Stone stopped. Started again differently. "Is there someone I should call for you?" "No," Gideon said. Then, because honesty had gotten him this far, there's nobody to call. Stone looked at him for 3 seconds. Not with pity. Gideon had gotten good at spotting pity, and this wasn't it. This was something harder to define. Recognition, maybe. The specific look of someone who has been in some other time or form exactly where you are. Then you stay here, he said. You're not going anywhere until you're stable. We clear. Gideon nodded. Stone turned toward the door. 3 men fell in behind him without a word. The automatic synchronicity of people who have moved together long enough that communication is mostly unnecessary. One of them paused long enough to squeeze Ren's hand as he passed, and she grabbed his finger and held it for a moment, and the big man stood very still and let her. There was a whole story in that pause that Gideon didn't know yet. Then they were gone, and the door closed, and Gideon was left with the old man who was still examining his fingers, and the remaining bikers, and Ren, who looked up from her zipper project and noticed that the room had fewer people in it, and filed this new data with a thoughtful expression. "Where Bear go?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then one of the remaining men, younger red-headed, wearing a prospect's patch, said very gently, "He went to go check on your daddy's sweetheart." Ren considered this. "Daddy hurt," she said. It was a statement, not a question. The steadiness of it was remarkable. She said it the way she might say Daddy big or Daddy loud, as a fact about her father, part of who he was. "Yeah," the prospect said. "Daddy got hurt, but there are doctors helping him." "Like doctors fix." "Yeah, like doctors fix." She nodded slowly. Then she looked across the room at Gideon, direct and deliberate. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. She nodded again as if this confirmed something she'd already decided and went back to her zipper. The old man who Gideon eventually learned was called Doc, not because he was an actual doctor, but because he'd been an EMT for 20 years before his knees gave out, finished his examination by wrapping both of Gideon's hands in warm, dry cloths and telling him in precise, unemotional terms that he'd caught it in time, that he'd have some residual numbness for a few days, that 2 of his toes were going to be uncomfortable for a week, but were not in danger. Then he looked at Gideon's face and said, "When did you last eat?" Gideon thought about it. "Yesterday, maybe." "What did you eat?" "Half a sandwich. Someone threw it out." Doc looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up, went behind the bar, and came back with a bowl of something that had been in a pot on the back burner. Chili, thick and dark and smelling of cumin and old heat. He put it in front of Gideon without a word. Then he put a piece of cornbread next to it. Then he put a glass of water down and said, slowly well, and walked away. Gideon ate slowly. He watched Ren while he ate. She had been transferred at some point from the bar to the couch, not his couch, a different one, across the room, and was now sitting in the lap of a large man with a long gray braid who was reading to her from a battered paperback that was almost certainly not intended as children's literature, but who was managing the delivery with such careful, rumbling seriousness that Ren was listening with total absorption. Every few lines she would interrupt to ask a question. Every few questions he would answer with grave patience. It was the most incongruous thing Gideon had ever seen, and he couldn't look away from it. That was when he heard the name the first time. It came from behind him. 2 men talking low, thinking they were out of earshot. Same office that processed the Hartwell file. "You don't know that yet. I know what Cade told me before he left. I know what he found." A pause. "And I know that kid showing up here tonight with Ren is not a coincidence. Everything isn't connected, Church. Everything is connected. That's the whole point. That's what Cade was trying to prove." Vance. The name landed somewhere in Gideon's memory and stuck. He kept eating. He kept his eyes on Ren. He kept his face completely neutral and made himself breathe normally and did not turn around. Because he had heard that name before. Not tonight, not here, 3 weeks ago, before Ren, before the storm, before any of this. When he'd been huddled in the stairwell of a county building trying to stay warm, invisible the way homeless teenagers are invisible in public buildings, present, but not registered, seen but not perceived. And 2 men in good suits had walked past talking about files and timelines and the kind of careful, deliberate language that people use when they're discussing something they're not supposed to be discussing in a county building stairwell. And one of them had said a name, Vance, County Commissioner Clayton Vance. And the other one had laughed and said, "Vance is covered. He's always covered. That's the whole point of Vance. Gideon had not known what that meant at the time, had filed it away in the back of his mind the way you file away things that feel wrong but aren't your problem. He had enough of his own problems. He had a sick mother and $11 in a city that had just informed him through the medium of a padlock on a door that he no longer had anywhere to sleep. But sitting here now in this room, hearing that name again, coming out of the mouths of men who were using it in connection with Cade Hartwell, with files with things Cade had been trying to prove before he collapsed in a hospital parking lot and handed his daughter to a stranger. Gideon put down his spoon. He turned around. The two men stopped talking. "I know that name," Gideon said. They stared at him. "Vance," he said. "Clayton Vance. I've heard it before, recently." He paused. "I think I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Then one of the men, heavy-set 40s, a patch that said church on it, leaned forward and said very quietly, "How recently? 3 weeks ago," Gideon said. "County building on Mercer Street. I was in the stairwell, two guys in suits. They were talking about files being buried and Vance being covered." He stopped, thought. They said something about a housing wait list. They said something about corrections. Clerical corrections. The man called church went very still. "Clerical corrections," he repeated. "Those exact words." "Yeah. You're sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure." Church stood up, looked at the other man. The other man looked back at him. Then Church pulled out his phone and said, "I need to call Stone." And Gideon sat in the warm room, his hands wrapped in cloth, a child asleep across the room in the arms of a biker who was still holding an open paperback, and felt something shift beneath the surface of the night. Some tectonic thing, slow and enormous. The movement of forces that had been building pressure for a long, long time. That had been waiting maybe for exactly this. For an invisible boy that nobody was watching to walk into a stairwell at the right moment and hear exactly the wrong thing. His mother had been taken off the housing wait list 6 weeks ago, due to, in the letter's precise language, a clerical correction in the eligibility records. He had thought it was a bureaucratic error. He was beginning to understand that it was not. Outside, the storm was still howling. Inside, Ren slept. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and emergency stone, and his men were sitting in a waiting room fighting a different kind of storm. The kind you fight by sitting still and refusing to love and waiting to find out if your brother was going to make it through the night. And in the stairwell of a county building on Mercer Street 3 weeks ago, in a moment that nobody had marked as significant, a homeless boy had heard a name. And now everything was going to change. Church made the call, standing 6 feet away, not bothering to lower his voice, which told Gideon something about how quickly things had shifted in this room, how fast he had moved in these men's estimation, from stranger to something else. Something that required less caution and more urgency. "Stone," Church's voice was flat and controlled. The way voices get when the person using them is working hard to stay that way. The kid heard something 3 weeks ago, county building on Mercer, clerical corrections. Those exact words, same language as the Hartwell file. A pause. Yeah, I know. I'm asking you the same thing." Another pause. Longer. "How long?" He listened, his jaw tightened by a fraction. "Okay, we hold here." "Yeah." He put the phone down and looked at Gideon. "Stone's coming back," he said. "Cade made it through the first surgery. He's not stable yet, but he made it through." The relief that moved through the room was physical. Men's shoulders dropping, breath releasing. The specific loosening of people who have been braced for the worst and been given for the moment something other than that. The man with the gray braid who had fallen asleep himself with Ren still in his arms stirred without waking. Ren didn't move at all. "Good," Gideon said. "Good." Church agreed. Then he pulled a chair up across from the couch and sat down and looked at Gideon with the particular focus of a man who has just been handed a piece of a puzzle he's been working on for a long time. "Now," he said, "tell me everything you heard. Not the summary. Everything, every word you can remember." So Gideon told it again, more slowly this time, more carefully. He closed his eyes and went back to the stairwell on Mercer Street. The cold concrete underarm, the smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee, the sound of dress shoes on the stairs above. Two men descending, Not running, not hurrying, comfortable. The specific ease of people who don't expect to be overheard because they have never in their experience been the kind of people that anyone paid attention to as a threat. The first voice had been older, graveled, the voice of someone who had been giving orders for so long that the habit had gotten into the way he breathed. The second was younger, faster, more precise. The voice of someone whose job it was to take the first man's intentions and translate them into language that sounded administrative. Vance said the correction runs clean, the younger voice had said. Audit trail goes back 4 years. Anyone who looks finds a legitimate eligibility review. And the Brennan family, removed from the list 6 weeks ago, clerical correction in the eligibility records. Gideon opened his eyes. Brennan, he said. That was the name they said. I didn't know who it was. It didn't mean anything to me at the time, but they were talking about a specific family, the Brennan family. Removed from the housing wait list, clerical correction. Church stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a long moment. When he turned around, his face had done something complicated that he was working to smooth back out. Alden Brennan, he said. Does that name mean anything to you? No, Gideon said. He was a city inspector, municipal housing department. 18 months ago, he filed a complaint, internal complaint through the proper channels about irregularities he'd found in the housing waitlist management. Families being bumped, priority cases disappearing, the algorithm producing results that didn't match the inputs. Church paused. 3 weeks after he filed that complaint, he was terminated. For guess what? Gideon felt it before the words came. Clerical error, Church said. Eligibility review on his professional certification. Turns out, according to somebody's records, he'd had a lapse. Small one, just enough to justify termination. Just enough to make it look procedural instead of retaliatory. He crossed his arms. He's been fighting it ever since. And his family, wife, 2 kids, they've been on the housing wait list since the termination. Priority status because of the circumstances. Supposed to be near the top. Removed 6 weeks ago, Gideon said. Removed 6 weeks ago, Church said. He looked at Gideon. Same week your mother was removed. The words landed quietly, but the quiet was the kind that comes after something breaks. Gideon heard his own breathing, heard it go slightly uneven, and then steady itself, because he was not going to fall apart in this room. Not now, not when this was the first time in weeks that anything had made any kind of sense. His mother wasn't on that wait list because of a computer error. She wasn't sick and sleeping in a shelter because the system had made a careless mistake. Someone had made a deliberate choice, had typed a command or signed a document or made a phone call, and his mother had been the consequence. That was different. That was completely different. How many families, he asked. His voice came out level. He was almost surprised. That's what Cade was trying to find out, Church said. That's why he left 3 months ago. He had contact with someone inside the county administrative office. Someone who reached out to him, said they had documentation, said they'd been watching the pattern for 2 years and were scared to go to anyone official because Vance has people in every official place worth having people in. He stopped. Cade went to meet that contact 6 weeks ago. We haven't heard from either of them since. The contact, Gideon said slowly. What do you know about them? Female, mid-30s, county records clerk. That's all Cade told us before he went dark. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, the second voice in the stairwell. Church frowned. What? I said there were 2 men, but that's not. Gideon stopped, pushed his memory harder, back into the cold and the smell of industrial cleaner, back into the specific acoustic quality of a concrete stairwell that carried sound in particular ways. There were 3 people, he said. I said 2 men because I heard 2 men speaking. But there was a third set of footsteps, lighter, stopping at the landing above me while the 2 men kept going down. Like someone who was following them, listening. The room had gone very quiet. I didn't think about it at the time, Gideon said. I thought it was just someone stopping to check their phone, or I didn't think about it. But those footsteps stopped directly above me. Church said it carefully. Not a question, a confirmation he needed to hear out loud. Yes, Gideon said. and I was in the stairwell because I was hiding because I was cold. But yeah, I wasn't visible from the landing above. So whoever stopped there would have heard the same conversation I heard. Or more, Church said. They had a better angle. Gideon nodded. Church picked his phone back up, dialed, waited. Then, Stone, there was a third person in that stairwell. Someone was tailing Vance's people. 6 weeks ago, Mercer Street. He listened. I don't know, but if Cade's contact was still active 6 weeks ago, a longer pause. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. He lowered the phone slowly. Stone wants us to sit tight, he said. He's going to be here in 40 minutes. Gideon nodded. He looked at his hands, at the cloth wrappings, at the fingers he could feel again, but wished currently he couldn't because what had been numbness was now a persistent, specific ache. He thought about his mother in the shelter on Fifth Street, asleep or not asleep, sick either way, waiting for a call back from a housing office that had already secretly decided she didn't exist. He thought about how many other people were waiting for the same callback. How many other families had received the same letter? Clerical correction, eligibility review, procedural and administrative, and designed to sound boring so no one would look too hard. He thought about a county commissioner who had been doing this for apparently years. He thought about the kind of confidence it took to do something for years, the kind of confidence that only comes from never being caught. I want to help, Gideon said. Church looked at him. I know what I heard, Gideon said. I know the voices. I could identify them again. And I was there. I was physically there, which means that if there's any camera footage from that stairwell, from that building, it would put me there at that time. It would corroborate everything. He paused. I know I'm 17 and homeless, and a judge would look at me and see about zero credibility. But I'm what you've got. You're not nothing, Church said. He said it plainly, without comfort, a voice which made it land differently, truer. You're an eyewitness. That's not nothing. I want to be more than an eyewitness, Gideon said. I want to... He stopped, searched for the right words. My mother did everything right. She paid her taxes. She applied through the right channels. She waited her turn. She didn't make trouble for anybody. And someone decided she didn't matter. Decided she was adjustable, removable, correctable. His voice did something he hadn't authorized, something that came from somewhere below rational thought, from the part of him that was 17 and exhausted and had been carrying things no 17-year-old should have to carry. He stopped, pressed his mouth together, forced it back. I want them to have been wrong, he said finally, about her, about us, about all of it. Church looked at him for a long time. Okay, he said. Okay, kid. Wren made a sound in her sleep, a small, unintelligible murmur, the kind children make when they're dreaming something busy. The man with the gray braids shifted without waking and adjusted his arm around her automatically, the deep muscle habit of someone who has done this before. Gideon watched them and felt something twist in his chest. Not pain exactly, something older and harder to name. He had not let himself think about what came after tonight. He had been very good these 11 days at not letting himself think past the immediate problem. The next meal, the next dry place, the next hour. Thinking further than that was a luxury he couldn't afford, because the further out you looked, the worse the picture got. And the worse the picture got, the harder it was to move at all. So he had kept himself small and present and focused on the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But sitting here in the warmth with Wren, asleep and safe and Kate alive, at least for now, the wall he'd been keeping up started to develop cracks, small ones, the kind you can't stop once they start. He was so tired, not the tired that sleep fixes, the tired that lives deeper than that, the tired of being invisible for months, of watching people's eyes slide past him, of doing everything right and watching it not matter, of holding himself together with the specific, desperate tension of someone who knows that if they stop even for a moment, they might not be able to start again. He heard the door before he saw it open. Stone came through first. Behind him, Garrett and two other men Gideon recognized from the initial crowd. They were moving with the contained energy of people who had been sitting in a hospital waiting room, running on bad coffee and controlled fear, and had now been given permission to move again. Stone's eyes went to Wren first, 1 second, then to Gideon. He's out of surgery, Stone said to the room. Critical but stable, ICU. They're saying 48 hours before they can assess long-term. He paused. He's asking for Wren. She's asleep, said the man with the gray braid from across the room. I know, Stone said. His voice was softer for a moment. Let her sleep. Then the softness closed, and the other thing came back. The directed, purposeful attention that Gideon had registered from the first moment and was starting to understand was not coldness, but focus. Church told me about the third person in the stairwell, Stone said. Yeah, Gideon said. Walk me through it again. Gideon walked him through it. All of it, including the new detail, the third set of footsteps, the stopped pace, the listening position above the landing. Stone was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then he said, I think I know who that was. Everyone in the room waited. Cade's contact, Stone said. The records clerk. Her name is Sloane Calloway. We found her this afternoon. He let that sit. She's been in protective custody, self-arranged. She's been staying with her sister in Billings for 6 weeks, off her own lease, paying cash. She reached out to us through a back channel 2 days ago. She said she'd seen something at the county building on Mercer Street 6 weeks ago. She said she'd followed 2 of Vance's associates and overheard a conversation in a stairwell. The room processed this. She was there, Gideon said. She was there, Stone confirmed. He looked at Gideon with something that was close to wonder, or close to what wonder looks like on a face that doesn't wear it often. You were both in that stairwell at the same time, hearing the same conversation. And neither of you knew about the other. What did she document? Church asked. Enough, Stone said. Names, dates, internal file numbers. Years of clerical corrections tracked back to their source. All of them pointing up to Vance's office. All of them following the same pattern. Families removed from waitlist. Properties quietly reallocated. Developers who show up in Vance's donor records. He paused. She had it all documented. Cade was supposed to bring the documentation back here, to someone who could move it through channels that Vance doesn't control. And then Cade collapsed. The documentation, Gideon said carefully. Where is it? She has copies, Stone said, but she's scared. She says she'll turn it over, but only in person, only to someone she trusts, and only if she knows it's actually going somewhere. She's been sitting on this for 6 weeks watching nothing happen, and she doesn't trust the process anymore. He paused. She asked about Cade. When I told her he was alive, she cried for a while. Then she asked if there was anyone else. Something in the air of the room changed, in a particular way. Gideon felt it before he understood it. He looked at Stone. Stone was looking at him. No, Gideon said. You were in that stairwell, Stone said. You heard the same conversation. You can corroborate her account independently. That's not nothing. That's enormous. A records clerk with documentation and an independent eyewitness who heard the same conversation from a different vantage point. I'm 17, Gideon said. I'm a homeless teenager. They'll take one look at me. They'll take one look at you, Stone said, and see someone who had absolutely no reason to be involved in this. No agenda. No stake. I have a stake. My mother is on that list. Which makes you a victim, Stone said. Which makes you credible. Which makes you exactly the kind of witness that it's very hard to dismiss. He paused. I'm not asking you to walk into anything alone. I'm asking you if you're willing to stand in a room with a woman who's been alone with this for 6 weeks and tell her that she isn't anymore. The room was very quiet. Wren murmured again in her sleep. Gideon looked at her. He thought about a 2-year-old who had pointed into a storm and said, angels, and meant it, without reservation, without doubt, with the complete unguarded certainty of someone who has not yet learned that the world mostly doesn't deliver on its promises. He thought about her father on the cold concrete, holding the edge of her blanket with fingers that were giving out. Still holding, still holding. He thought about his mother's laugh. He thought about a letter that said clerical correction and had used administrative language to mean, you don't matter. We've decided, and there is nothing you can do. When, Gideon said. Stone almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it changed something at the edges. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight you sleep, you eat. Doc checks those hands again in the morning. And if he says you're stable, he'll say I'm stable, Gideon said. Then tomorrow, Stone said, we go meet Sloane Calloway, and we figure out what years of buried truth actually costs. He looked around the room. at the men who had been afraid tonight, who had sat with bad news and held it together and were now being asked to hold together a little longer. It costs a lot, he said. We've already been paying it. Time to collect. Nobody spoke. Then Garrett said quietly, Cade's going to want to know. I'll tell him when he wakes up, Stone said. He's going to want to be there. He's in the ICU. I know, Garrett said. He's still going to want it to be there. Stone's mouth curved. Then he better wake up fast. Wren opened her eyes. She looked at the room, at Stone, at Garrett, at the familiar faces and the one that wasn't familiar but had been there since the beginning, since the storm, since she'd pointed into the dark and trusted something that wasn't visible yet. She looked at Gideon. Angels, she said, satisfied, complete. And in that word in the mouth of a 2-year-old who'd navigated a blizzard on faith alone was everything that needed to be said about what this night had been and what the next days were going to require. Gideon lay back on the couch. He closed his eyes, for the first time in 11 days in a room full of men who had not yet decided to trust him, but had decided to believe him, which was a different thing and in some ways more valuable. He slept. Outside, the storm was beginning finally to break. He slept 4 hours. It felt like 4 minutes. Doc woke him at 7 in the morning with 2 fingers on his shoulder and a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been on the burner since midnight and didn't apologize for it. Gideon sat up, took the cup, spent 30 seconds remembering where he was and why and what it meant. The remembering came in layers. Wren, Cade, the stairwell, Vance, Sloane Calloway. Each one settling on top of the last like cards being laid down on a table until the full hand was visible. Then he stood up. His legs protested. His hands ached with the deep, specific throb of tissue that had been in real danger and known it. His left foot had a quality to it that he chose not to examine too closely. But he was standing, and he was warm, and there was coffee, and somewhere across the city, a woman named Sloane Calloway had been alone with something enormous for 6 weeks. And today that was going to change. He drank the coffee, standing up. Wren was already awake. She was at the bar eating scrambled eggs with a concentration that suggested she had opinions about scrambled eggs. And next to her sat a woman Gideon hadn't seen the night before. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, dark hair pulled back, wearing a cut that identified her as something other than a member, but clearly not a stranger to this room. She was watching Wren eat with the practiced vigilance of someone who has done this kind of watching before and is good at it. She looked up when Gideon walked over. You're the kid, she said. Gideon, he said. Rosa, she said. I'm Garrett's wife. I also run the chapter's community outreach, which means I'm the one they call when there's a child involved and they want someone who won't accidentally terrify her. She looked at him steadily. You did a good thing last night. I made a promise, he said. Same thing, Lena, she said. Wren looked up from her eggs. Gideon, she said, with a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone confirming a detail they have already filed correctly. Hey, Wren, he said. She pointed at his coffee. Hot, she said, with the gravity of a public service announcement. Yeah, he agreed. I know, thank you. She nodded and went back to her eggs. Stone came through the door at 7:30. Garrett 2 steps behind him. Both of them carrying the compressed, alert energy of men who had not slept, but were refusing to let that be anyone's problem. Stone looked at Gideon, looked at his hands, looked at his face. Doc clear you, he asked. He will, Gideon said. Stone almost smiled. Go find him. Doc was in the back room and he did his examination with the same methodical quiet as the night before, working through each finger, pressing specific points, watching Gideon's face for involuntary reaction. When he finished, he sat back and said, The hands are better than they should be. The toe on the left foot, I want you to keep it drying off concrete as much as you can for a week. You're going to be sore, and that's appropriate. You're not going to lose anything. He paused. You understand what I'm telling you. You came close. The margin was not comfortable. I know, Gideon said. I want you to actually know it, Doc said. Well, file it away and move on. What you did last night, the physical reality of what you put your body through, that matters. That has a cost. I know, Gideon said again. And then because Doc was looking at him with the specific patience of someone who was not going to let this go, I'll take care of it. I'll be careful. Doc studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once. The way men nod when they've said what needed saying, and trust you to carry it. Gideon went back out front. Stone was on the phone. Church was at the table with a laptop and a legal pad covered in handwriting. Garrett was talking low and fast to two other men near the door. Rosa had moved Ren from the bar to the couch and was doing something with her hair. Some kind of braid that Ren was submitting to with the stoic patience of a child who has opinions about hair touching, but has decided in this particular instance to allow it. The room had the texture of an operation coming together. Gideon recognized it. The way you recognize things you've only seen in movies and then encounter in real life. The specific purposeful bustle of people who know their parts and are running them without needing to announce them. Stone lowered his phone and looked at Gideon. Sloan agreed to the meeting, he said. Neutral location. Her choosing. She's been careful for 6 weeks and she's not going to stop being careful. Because we ask nicely. She picks the place. She picks the time. She has a 30-minute window, and if anything feels wrong to her, she walks. He paused. She also asked specifically about you. Gideon blinked. About me. She asked if the boy was coming. Stone watched his face. I didn't tell her your name. I told her there was an independent witness to the stairwell conversation. She asked if he was coming. You told her yes. I told her I'd ask. Then yes, Gideon said, immediately. Stone nodded. She said there's something else. Something she didn't tell Cade before he went dark. Something she's been holding back because she wasn't sure who she could trust. He let that sit for a second. She said it involves a name that Cade would recognize. She wouldn't say more on the phone. The temperature in Gideon's understanding went up a degree. Something bigger than the wait list. I think the wait list was always the surface, Church said from a seat at the table without looking up from the legal pad. Years of systematic removal of low-income families from housing priority lists. Properties being quietly reallocated to developers who fund a specific county commissioner's campaigns. That's not a housing scandal. That's money laundering with an administrative layer on top. He looked up now. The housing program receives federal funds, which means what Vance has been doing isn't just corrupt local politics, it's federal fraud. The weight of that settled over the room, which is why he's been so careful, Garrett said. Local investigators, he can manage. Federal is a different problem. Which is why Sloan is scared, Stone said, and why she's been sitting on the complete picture for 6 weeks instead of taking it to the FBI directly. He looked at Church. She doesn't trust that Vance doesn't have reach into the local federal office. Does he? Gideon asked. We don't know, Stone said. That's one of the things we need to find out today. They took 2 vehicles, Stone and Garrett and Gideon in one, Church and 2 others following in the second. Gideon sat in the back with his wrapped hands on his knees and watched the city pass outside the window. The morning after the storm, everything covered in the specific white quiet of snow that had stopped falling and not yet been disturbed. He thought about his mother waking up in the shelter on 5th Street, thought about the routine of it, the communal breakfast, the check-in with the caseworker, the measured, careful hours of a day shaped entirely by systems designed by people who had never spent a night in one. Stone, he said, yeah. My mother, if this moves forward, if there's an investigation, if Sloan's documentation goes somewhere, what happens to the families, the ones who were removed from the wait list? Stone was quiet for a moment. Honest answer, please. I don't know, Stone said. Best case, the removals get flagged as fraudulent. The affected families get reinstated. And the process moves forward the way it was supposed to. Realistic case, it's slow. Bureaucracy that was deliberately broken doesn't unbreak quickly. He glanced back at Gideon in the rear view. But Sloan's documentation includes the original eligibility records, before the corrections, which means there's a paper trail to who those families were and where they stood before Vance's people got into the system. That's not nothing. How long? Gideon asked. Stone didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. We'll fight for as short as possible, Garrett said from the passenger seat. That's all we can promise. Gideon looked back out the window. Sloan Calloway had chosen a diner. Corner booth, back wall, sightline to both the entrance and the kitchen door. She was already there when they arrived, sitting with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the door. She was small, compact, with dark circles under eyes that were very awake, and a stillness about her that Gideon recognized as the stillness of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had organized it into something functional. She looked at Stone first, then Garrett. Then her eyes moved to Gideon and stayed there. He slid into the booth across from her. Stone sat beside him. Garrett took the small table adjacent facing the door. "You're the boy from the stairwell," she said. "Yeah," Gideon said. "How old are you?" 17. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, something more like recognition of a particular kind of injustice, the kind that arrives in small, specific details. "You were homeless," she said. "You were there because you were cold." "Yeah, and you heard them, the whole thing." Gideon said the words, clerical corrections, the Brennan family, Vance being covered. I didn't understand what I was hearing at the time. I do now. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Stone. "He's not protected," she said. "If this goes federal and Vance's people start identifying witnesses, a 17-year-old homeless kid is the easiest target in the room." "We know that," Stone said. "I need to know what you're going to do about it." "He won't be alone," Stone said. "From this point forward, he won't be alone. I give you my word." She looked back at Gideon. "Is that enough for you?" she asked. Not rhetorically, actually asking, actually waiting for his answer. "Yeah," he said. "That's enough." She exhaled. Something released in her shoulders, small, barely visible, but real. "Okay," she said. "Then I'll tell you the rest." She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. She didn't open it yet. She held it flat on the table under both hands and looked at it for a moment, as if she was saying goodbye to a version of the last 6 weeks. The version where she alone knew what was in it, where she alone carried it. "The waitlist fraud is documented," she said. "I have the original records, the altered records, the transaction logs showing who made the changes and when. I have emails, internal emails from Vance's office to the third-party vendor that manages the county's housing database, instructing specific modifications. I have the developer payment records. I have everything that connects the removals to the money." She paused. "But that's not what I've been afraid to tell anyone." The diner noise went on around them. Plates, low conversation, the sound of a normal Tuesday morning. Inside the booth, nobody moved. "3 years ago," Sloan said, "a family filed an appeal. Mother, father, 3 kids. They'd been removed from the wait list and they knew something was wrong. They'd done everything right. They had their documentation. They hired a legal aid attorney and they filed a formal appeal through the county administrative court." She stopped. "The father's name was Rowan Mercer." Stone's hands flat on the table went very still. "I know that name," Garrett said from the adjacent table. "Yes," Sloan said, "you do." She looked at Stone. "He was one of yours, former member. Left the chapter in good standing 5 years before this, living clean, working construction, trying to make it work for his family." "Rowan," Stone said. The word was very quiet. "He filed the appeal," Sloan said. "The appeal went through the proper channels, and I watched it. I watched every step. Because by that point, I'd already started documenting the pattern, and I wanted to see what happened when someone actually pushed back." She pressed her hands harder on the envelope. "What happened was his appeal was dismissed. Administrative grounds. His attorney was then contacted by the state bar about an ethics complaint. Anonymous complaint. Ultimately unfounded. But it took 8 months to resolve and cost the attorney enough that she stopped taking housing cases." She paused. "And Rowan Mercer, 2 weeks after his appeal was dismissed, was in a car accident." Nobody spoke. "The official report said black ice," Sloan said. "It was February. Black ice is not implausible. His wife accepted it. The insurance company accepted it. Everyone accepted it." She looked at Stone. "I don't accept it." Stone was looking at her with an expression that was very controlled and very dangerous, in the specific way that grief makes certain men dangerous. Not explosive, not visible, but deep and directional, like a current that runs under everything. "You have something," he said, "something that made you not accept it." "Vance's office has a problem," Sloan said. "His executive assistant is meticulous. She documents everything. Meeting logs, call logs, visitor records cross-referenced against Vance's calendar. It's good practice. She does it to protect herself, I think, because she's been with him long enough to know she needs a record of what she was and wasn't present for." She opened the envelope now. She laid 3 sheets of paper on the table. "These are excerpts from her logs. I got copies through a source I'm not going to identify." Look at the dates. Gideon looked. He didn't know what he was seeing. The names and reference numbers meant nothing to him without context. But Stone picked up the first sheet, and he read it, and the muscle in his jaw moved. 14 days before the accident, Stone said, Vance met with someone identified only as a case management consultant. He looked up. There is a follow-up notation. 18 days after the accident, same individual. Meeting noted as case resolved. Case resolved, Church repeated. He'd moved from the adjacent table without Gideon noticing, was now standing at the edge of the booth. They logged it, Stone said. She logged it, Sloan said. She logs everything. She doesn't know what half of it means. She logs what happens. It's not evidence of what I think it means, she continued, but combined with the timing, with the appeal, with the pattern, it's a thread. It's a thread, Stone said. Pull it right, Sloan said, and it unravels 15 years. Gideon looked at the papers on the table, at the dates, the notations, the careful administrative language that said case resolved and meant something that administrative language was never supposed to mean. He thought about Rowan Mercer, who had done everything right, who had filed the right paperwork and hired the right attorney and gone through the right channels, and had been deleted, efficiently, with the specific practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this for a long time and had learned exactly how much force was necessary and where to apply it. Stone, he said. Stone looked at him. How many, Gideon said. How many Rowan Mercers? Stone didn't answer. That's what we don't know, Sloan said quietly. The housing fraud that's documented. That's provable. But the other thing, the people who push back and then stop pushing back. I've identified 3 cases where the timeline looks wrong. Rowan is the most extreme. The other 2, one withdrew a complaint, relocated out of state within 6 months. One had a series of bureaucratic problems that destroyed his small business, right around the time he was making noise. None of it is provable in isolation, she said. She paused. Together, it's a pattern. And patterns, Church said, are what prosecutors love. Which brings us to the federal question, Stone said. He looked at Sloan. You said you don't trust the local field office. I don't know that I don't trust it, she said. I know that Vance has demonstrated over 15 years an ability to stay ahead of scrutiny. I know that 2 separate county-level investigations were opened in the last decade, and both were quietly closed. I know that someone is telling him when to be careful. She paused. I don't know if that someone is in the local federal office, but I'm not willing to bet my life on it. And yours, she added, looking at Gideon. There's another way in, the Church said. Everyone looked at him. He had his phone out, turned it to show Stone, then Sloan, a name on the screen. Alden Brennan, he said, the inspector who filed the internal complaint 18 months ago. His case was federal. He filed through OSHA's whistleblower protection program. That filing created a federal case number. That case number is technically still open because it was never formally closed. It was just buried. He paused. If Brennan is willing to amend his complaint and attach new documentation, it goes directly back to the federal whistleblower apparatus, not the local field office. Washington. Sloan stared at him. Brennan would have to be willing to take that step. Does he have a reason not to be? Gideon asked. He has every reason not to be, Sloan said. They took his job, his certification, his family's place on the wait list. He's been fighting through proper channels for 18 months and getting nowhere. Men who've been through that go one of 2 ways. They go harder or they give up. She paused. I don't know which way Alden Brennan went. I can find out, Rosa said. Every head turned. Rosa was standing just inside the diner entrance, which meant she'd been there long enough to hear most of it, which meant Stone had told her to come and positioned her at the door as a second set of eyes without announcing it to anyone, including Sloan, who looked at her with a flash of alarm. She's with us, Stone said. Immediately, completely. Rosa crossed to the booth. She looked at Sloan directly, without the soft approach voice that people sometimes used on frightened witnesses. She spoke to her like an equal. Alden Brennan's wife, Carmen, volunteers at the same family resource center I run outreach for. I've met her 4 times. She doesn't know who I am beyond that context, but I know her. And I can tell you this, she is not a woman who has given up. She paused. Neither, I think, is her husband. Sloan looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face made a decision. Okay, she said, then we need to move fast, because in the last 48 hours, something changed. She reached back into the envelope and pulled out one more sheet. I have a contact who still works in the county building. Yesterday morning, there was an unscheduled visit from two men to Vance's office. They weren't there long, but they accessed the housing database. She put the paper on the table. They ran a query. The search parameters were for flagged appeals from the last 4 years. She let that land. They're looking for something, or they're checking that something hasn't been found. They know the documentation exists, Church said. I think they're starting to suspect it, Sloan said. Cade went dark. They know Cade was making noise. They know because Cade's contact getting bumped from the wait list was retaliatory. I believe that now. And if Vance's people have been tracking the noise Cade was making before he collapsed, they might know he had a meeting scheduled. Which means they know the meeting didn't happen, Stone said. His voice had gone very flat. Which means they know the documentation is still out there somewhere, Sloan said. Which means, Garrett said from the door, we have less time than we thought. The booth went quiet. Gideon looked at the papers on the table. 3 sheets of paper and an envelope. 15 years of deliberate cruelty compressed into dates and reference numbers. And the words case resolved. He thought about Rowan Mercer. He thought about his mother. He thought about the Brennan family and the unnamed others. All the people who had been clerical corrected out of existence by a system that was supposed to protect them. He picked up one of the sheets, looked at it, put it back down. I want to go see Alden Brennan, he said. Stone looked at him. Not instead of the federal filing, Gideon said quickly. In addition to it, before it. Because you said Sloan needs to know the documentation is going somewhere real before she hands it over. And Brennan needs to know the same thing. And I think, he stopped, found the words. I think someone who's been through what he's been through needs to hear it from someone who's also been through something. Not from a lawyer, not from a strategy meeting, from a person. Rosa looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Stone looked at him the same way. You're 17, Stone said. I know, Gideon said. But I'm also the person who walked 6 miles through a blizzard on a 2-year-old's directions and ended up in the right place. So maybe my navigation isn't as bad as it looks. Garrett made a sound that was almost a laugh. Stone picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. Rosa, he said. I'll make the call, she said. Church? Already on Brennan's federal case number, Church said. Phone in hand. Sloan. Stone looked at her across the table. How long can you stay safe? As long as I stay moving, she said. Then stay moving. Stay with us. Don't go back to your sisters. If they're querying the database, they might start querying other things. He paused. We have a place. It's not a hotel, but it's safe. She looked at him, at the table of papers, at Gideon. She was doing the calculation that people do when they've been alone with something for 6 weeks and someone is offering to share the weight. The calculation between relief and exposure, between trusting and risking. It was written clearly on her face because she was tired enough that she'd stopped hiding it. Okay, she said finally. Okay, Stone said. And in a corner booth of an ordinary diner on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the pieces of 15 years of buried truth were laid on a table and counted and named and claimed by the people who had paid for them. Paid in evictions, in silence, in accidents on roads with black ice, and a 17-year-old boy walking through a blizzard with nothing but a promise and someone else's child in his arms. Outside, the snow from the night before was melting. Not fast, not all at once, but it was melting. Rosa made the call to Carmen Brennan from the diner parking lot, while Stone settled the check and Sloan sat in the back of the first vehicle with her envelope on her lap and her eyes on the door, watching the street, with the practiced vigilance of someone who had been doing threat assessment for 6 weeks and was not going to stop now, just because the room had gotten more crowded. The call took 4 minutes. Rosa came back with her phone at her side and her expression carrying something careful in it. Not bad news, not good news. The specific in-between of a situation that could go either way, depending on the next 10 minutes. Carmen said Alden will talk, she said. But she also said, and I want to be clear that she said this before I told her anything about Vance or the documentation, she said he's been in a bad place the last 6 months. She said the fight went out of him around the time the second attorney dropped his case. She looked at a Stone. She didn't ask who we were beyond the resource center connection. She just said, come before he changes his mind. How far? Stone asked. 20 minutes. Then we go now. Gideon rode in the first vehicle again, between Stone and the window, watching the city unspool around him. He was thinking about what Rosa had said. The fight went out of him, and feeling it in a particular way, the way you feel a description that matches something you know. He knew what it looked like when the fight went out of a person. He'd watched it happen to his mother in the weeks after the letter came. Watched her read it twice and then fold it very precisely and set it on the table and not say anything for a long time. She hadn't cried. She'd just gotten quieter. And quiet in his mother was the most frightening thing. The Brennan house was small. He didn't know the neighborhood, didn't know the house, but he knew the feeling of it. The feeling of a place that had been carefully maintained right up until the moment maintaining it became one thing too many, and now showed the specific, dignified exhaustion of a family that was still trying but had fewer resources to try with. Carmen met them at the door, a woman in her early 40s, compact and direct, with the eyes of someone who had been doing all the emotional labor for a household in crisis, and was good at it and tired of being good at it. She looked at the group, counted them, looked at Gideon last. You brought a kid, she said to Rosa. He's why we're here, Rosa said. Carmen looked at Gideon for another second. Something shifted in her assessment. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Alden's in the kitchen. Alden Brennan was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug, and Gideon understood immediately what Carmen had meant about the fight. He was a man who had been substantial. You could see it in the frame of him, in the breadth of the shoulders, in the hands that wrapped the mug. But something had happened to the interior of him. Some structural thing had given. And what was left was a man who took up less space than his body suggested he should. He was in his mid-40s. He looked older. He looked up when they came in. His eyes moved through the group and landed on Stone with the particular weariness of someone who has learned that unfamiliar people bearing news generally mean more bad news. Alden Brennan, Stone said, not a question. Yeah, Alden said. People call me Stone. He pulled a chair out and sat down across from Alden without being invited. The way a man sits when he's decided that formality is a luxury this conversation doesn't have time for. I knew Rowan Mercer. Alden went very still. I know what happened to him, Stone said. I believed for 3 years that it wasn't an accident, and I now have documentation that puts a meeting in Vance's calendar 14 days before Rowan died, and a follow-up notation 18 days after. Marked case resolved. He paused. I'm not telling you this to reopen a wound. I'm telling you because you need to know what you were up against, and why nobody helped you, and why your case kept dying every time you brought it back to life. Alden's hands tightened on the mug. Who's the kid? He asked. His voice was careful, contained. My name's Gideon Hayes, Gideon said. He sat down without being invited, the way Stone had, because he had decided in the car that this was not a moment for deference. 3 weeks ago, I was in the stairwell of the county building on Mercer Street, and I heard 2 of Vance's people talking about a clerical correction on the Brennan family. Your family. He held Alden's gaze. I was there because I was homeless and I was cold. I wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody knew I was there. He paused. My mother was removed from the same wait list the same week as you. Same language. Clerical correction. I thought it was a computer mistake. It wasn't. Alden looked at him for a long time. You're 17, he said. Yes, sir. You've been on the streets. 11 days when this started. More now. Alden looked at Carmen. Carmen looked back at him with the expression of a woman who is not going to make this decision for him, but is going to be completely honest about what she thinks. And what she thought was visible in her face without a word. Alden looked back at Gideon. What do you want from me? He asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Church found your federal case number, Gideon said. The complaint you filed through the whistleblower program 18 months ago, it was never formally closed. It's still technically open. He leaned forward slightly. If you amend the complaint and attach Sloan's documentation, it goes directly to Washington. Not the local field office. Not anyone Vance has reach into. He paused. But it has to be you. You're the one with the open case. You're the federal anchor. Alden's jaw moved. He looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that the silence started to have weight. I had a lawyer, he said. She was good, she believed me. And then an ethics complaint landed on her desk. Anonymous. Turned out to be nothing. But it cost her 8 months, and enough that she walked away from housing cases. He looked up. After that, I tried to find someone else. 3 people. Every one of them, something happened. Not dramatic, just enough. Enough to make it not worth it for them. He stopped. I started thinking I was cursed. You weren't cursed, Stone said. You were targeted, precisely and deliberately, by people who have been doing this for 15 years and know exactly how much pressure it takes to make someone stop. He paused. But they made a mistake. Alden looked at him. They kept records, Stone said. Vance's assistant logs everything. They got complacent. They've been doing this so long without consequence that they started believing they were invisible. And invisible people get careless. He picked up the sheaf of papers that Church had passed him in the car. Copies, Sloane's copies, the documentation that had been living in an envelope for 6 weeks waiting for exactly this room. He laid them on the table in front of Alden. It's all here, 15 years, your family, Rowan Mercer's family, the Hayes, 47 other families we've been able to identify so far, the payment records, the email instructions, the calendar entries. He paused. And an eyewitness who was in the right stairwell at the right time because he was cold. Alden looked at the papers. He didn't touch them immediately. He looked at them the way you look at something you've wanted for a long time and are afraid isn't real. Afraid that if you reach for it, it will turn out to be the wrong thing after all. Carmen put her hand on his shoulder from behind. He reached up and covered her hand with his without looking away from the papers. If I file the amended complaint, he said slowly, and it goes to Washington, what happens to my family while that's moving? Because that's not fast. Federal cases are not fast. And if Vance figures out what we've done, you won't be alone, Gideon said. Alden looked at him. That's what I can tell you, Gideon said. Not as a strategy, as a fact. You will not be alone while this moves. He glanced at Stone, at Rosa, at Garrett standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face set. These people showed up for a stranger last night. A homeless kid they'd never met who showed up half dead at their door with somebody else's baby. They didn't have to do anything for me. They did it anyway. He paused. They'll show up for you, and for Carmen, and for your kids. Alden was quiet. The fight went out of me, he said finally, more just to himself than anyone. Carmen's hand tightened on his shoulder. Carmen kept saying it wasn't over. I kept telling her I was done, that the system was too big and too dirty, and we were too small. He looked at Gideon. And now you're sitting in my kitchen, a 17-year-old kid who walked 6 miles through a blizzard with a baby because he made a promise to someone he'd known for 4 minutes. The storm was bad, Gideon said, but I got here. Something broke open in Alden Brennan's face. Not dramatically, quietly, the way things break that had been under pressure for a long time. His eyes went bright. He pressed his mouth together. He looked at the papers. Then he reached out and picked them up. Show me where to sign, he said. What happened in the next 72 hours moved the way things move when they've been dammed up for a long time, and the dam finally breaks. Not orderly, not smooth, but with the specific unstoppable force of water finding its own level. Alden Brennan's amended complaint attached to Sloan Calloway's complete documentation package went to the federal whistleblower office in Washington on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, 2 federal investigators flew into Billings from the regional office, not the local field office, the regional, exactly as Church had planned. By Friday morning, Clayton Vance's county office had received a document preservation notice, which was the federal equivalent of someone putting a hand very firmly on your shoulder and telling you not to move. Gideon wasn't in the room for most of it. He was in the hospital. Kate Hartwell had woken up on Wednesday. Stone got the call at 6 in the morning and was at the hospital by 6:15. And Gideon rode with him because by that point, nobody had suggested that Gideon should be anywhere other than where this story was unfolding. And Gideon had stopped waiting to be included and started simply being present, which was a different thing, and felt more honest. Cade was in the ICU, propped up, still attached to things that beeped. His color still wrong in the way that people look wrong when their body has been through something serious and is still negotiating. But his eyes were open. and they were clear. And when Stone walked through the door, Cade looked at him with an expression that had too many things in it to name all at once. Relief, guilt, the specific grief of a man who has been unconscious through a crisis that other people manage without him. Ren, he said. First word. Safe, Stone said. She's with Rosa. She's fine, Cade. She's perfect. He pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down and looked at his brother with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has been waiting for this moment for days and is not going to rush it now that it's here. She found us. She found you, Cade said. His voice was rough, abraded. I told her the angels. I didn't know if I was so, he stopped. His jaw worked. I couldn't hold on anymore. I could feel it. I knew I was going down and she was right there and I couldn't. She wasn't alone, Stone said. Cade looked past him, at Gideon who was standing in the doorway, not sure if this was his room to be in. Come here, Cade said. The same way he'd said it in Gideon's memory of the parking lot. Direct, not optional. Gideon came to the bedside. Cade Hartwell looked at him. The way people look at things they need to fully see, without hurry, without performance, taking in the wrapped hands, the face that was young in years and not young in experience, the posture of someone who has been holding himself together by force of will for long enough that it had become structural. She was warm, Cade asked. The whole way? The whole way, Gideon said. You carried her. The whole way. Yes, sir. 6 miles. Give or take. Cade's throat moved. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at Gideon and said very quietly, I owe you something I don't have words for. You don't owe me anything, Gideon said. Don't tell me what I owe, Cade said. And there was a warmth in the roughness of it. Something that was almost a laugh. I get to decide what I owe. He paused. Stone told me about Vance, about your mother, about the stairwell. He paused again. About all of it. We filed the amended complaint yesterday, Gideon said. Alden Brennan signed everything. Federal investigators are already moving. Cade closed his eyes, kept them closed for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with fever. Sloan, he said. She's safe, Stone said. She's staying with Rosa. She's been deposed once already. She held on, Cade said. All that time, she held on. She did, Stone said. Cade looked at Gideon again. Your mother, he said. Where is she? Still at the shelter on 5th, Gideon said. I haven't told her any of this yet. I didn't want to tell her something was happening until I knew something was actually happening. Something is actually happening, Cade said. Yeah, Gideon said. I know. Go tell her, Cade said. Right now, get up and go tell her. He said it with the specific, direct authority of a man who knows what it is to have someone wait too long to hear good news. She's been sitting in that shelter, not knowing where any of this is going. Go tell her. Gideon looked at Stone. Stone tilted his head toward the door. Go. Gideon went. He took a cab because Stone pressed $40 into his hand before he left and told him not to argue. And he didn't argue. He rode across the city and paid the driver and walked through the shelter's front door and found his mother in the common room, sitting by the window with a book she wasn't reading, her hands still on the pages, her eyes on the middle distance. She saw him the moment he came through the door. She was out of her chair before he reached her. She held him at arm's length for 1 second, looking at his wrapped hands, at his face, at the specific exhaustion and something else that was visible in him, and he watched her try to read all of it at once and not be able to. What happened to your hands, she said. I'm fine, he said. Gideon, Mom. He put his hands on her shoulders. Sit down. I need to tell you something. He waited until she sat, pulled a chair up directly in front of her, took both her hands in his wrapped ones. I need to tell you what happened to the wait list, what actually happened, because it wasn't a mistake. He paused. But it's being fixed right now. It's being fixed. And I need you to hear how, because it's a long story, and some of it is going to be hard to hear. And some of it is his voice did the thing. It did the unauthorized thing, the thing from below. He stopped, steadied. Some of it's pretty good, actually. She looked at him, at his hands, at his face. You're okay, she asked. Just that. Yeah, Mom, he said. I'm okay. She squeezed his hands. Then tell me. So he told her. All of it. From the parking lot to the storm, to Wren and the Angels, to the stairwell, and Vance and Sloan Calloway, and Alden Brennan, and the federal complaint moving in Washington right now. Today, this morning, while they sat here in a shelter common room with bad lighting and plastic chairs. He told it the way he'd been telling pieces of it all week. Flat, honest, in order. But this time he was telling it to someone who had been at the beginning of it, whose name was in those corrupted files, whose silence in the weeks after the letter had been the thing he'd been carrying without knowing what to call it. She didn't interrupt. She sat very still and listened, the way she had always listened, completely, without performance, giving him the specific attention of a person who understands that what someone is telling you matters more than what you're going to say back. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You walked 6 miles in that storm." "Yeah, with a baby." "She's little," he said. His mother looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. "You're going to tell me it wasn't a big deal," she said. "I made a promise," he said. "It wasn't really a choice." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a song and was entirely her. She pulled him forward and held his head against her shoulder. The way she had when he was small, when the world was less complicated and the problems were the size that mothers can fix. He let her. He was 17 and he had walked 6 miles through a blizzard and been in rooms with federal witnesses and motorcycle club leaders and a man who had nearly died and woken up asking for his daughter. And he was so tired. And she was his mother, and he let her. "It's going to take time," he said into her shoulder. "The case, the reinstatement, it's not going to be tomorrow." "I know," she said, "but it's moving. It's actually moving." "I know," she said again. Her hand was on the back of his head. "We're okay. You hear me? We're okay." 6 weeks later, Clayton Vance resigned from the county commissioner's office, citing personal reasons. The resignation came 24 hours after federal investigators executed a document preservation order that extended to his personal financial records. His office issued a statement. Nobody believed the statement. Nobody was supposed to. Alden Brennan's professional certification was reinstated by the state licensing board following a formal review that found the original revocation had been based on fabricated documentation. The finding was made public. The board issued an apology. Alden read it twice and then set it on the table and was quiet for a while. And Carmen put her hand on his shoulder, and they sat together in their kitchen with the papers laid out in front of them and let themselves feel finally what they had not allowed themselves to feel for 18 months. Sloan Calloway was placed under formal federal witness protection during the investigation. She didn't need it for as long as she expected. Vance's network, it turned out, was less loyal than it was self-interested. And when the weight started shifting, people started talking. With a speed that surprised even the investigators. The 47 families identified in Sloan's documentation were formally notified of the investigation. The process of reinstating their housing priority status began. Slower than anyone wanted, faster than anyone expected, which is roughly how justice moves when it finally decides to move. Evelyn Hayes received her reinstatement letter on a Friday morning. She read it standing in the shelter common room, in the bad lighting, with the plastic chairs, and she did not fold it precisely and set it on the table. She held it with both hands for a long time, and then she sat down on the floor right where she was, and she pressed it to her chest, and she cried. The specific released crying of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has finally been allowed to put it down. Gideon was not there for that moment. He was at the hospital. Cade Hartwell was being discharged. He came through the hospital exit with Stone on one side and Garrett on the other, walking with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body had been through something real and was still negotiating the terms of normalcy. He looked better than he had the first time Gideon had seen him. He looked actually like the man Wren had described. Big, present, the kind of man who fills a room with his particular quality of being in it. Wren was outside waiting. Rosa had brought her, and she was standing on the sidewalk in a red jacket. And the moment the door opened and she saw her father, something happened in her small face. Something so complete and so simple that it required no description. Only witness. Cade went to one knee on the sidewalk, without hesitation, without caring about his knees or his recovery or the cold. and she ran the last 4 steps and hit him with everything she had. He wrapped both arms around her and pressed his face into her hair and held on, and the rest of the world continued happening around them. And they were not part of it for a moment. They were only themselves, in the specific, irreducible wholeness of a father and his daughter who had been separated by circumstances that should never have been allowed to exist and were now simply together. Gideon stood back, gave them the space. Cade looked up at him over Wren's shoulder. "Come here," he said, the same way he'd said it in the hospital room. Direct, not optional. Gideon came forward. Cade reached out and gripped his arm. Not a handshake, not a pat on the back. A grip, the kind that means something. "You're not going back to the streets," Cade said. "That's done. You hear me? That's over." Gideon looked at him. "We've got room," Cade said. "Good room, real room, not charity. You'll work for it if that's what it takes for you to accept it. But you're coming home with us." He paused. His eyes were very steady. "You carried my daughter through a storm because she believed someone would be waiting on the other side. I'm asking you to believe the same thing." Wren, from inside her father's arms, turned her head and looked at Gideon. "Angels," she said, "certain, complete." Gideon Hayes stood on that sidewalk in the thin winter sunlight and felt something shift in the architecture of himself. Something that had been braced and guarded and held carefully in place for months, maybe longer. The internal structure of a person who has learned not to expect anything so they can't be broken by the gap between expecting and receiving. He let it shift. "Okay," he said, "just that, just okay. Because some stories don't need more than that. Some moments are complete in themselves. A father on one knee, a daughter in his arms. A boy on the sidewalk who walked through the worst night of his life on a 2-year-old's faith and came out the other side into something he hadn't known to hope for. The broken system didn't fix itself overnight. The investigation ran for 14 months, produced 11 federal indictments, and returned names and standing to 47 families who had been erased from records that were supposed to protect them. It was slow. It was imperfect. It was the kind of justice that looks less like triumph and more like restoration. The painstaking work of putting things back that should never have been taken. But it moved. And it moved because a boy heard something he wasn't supposed to hear in a stairwell. He was only in because no one had protected him from the cold. And instead of staying invisible, he walked into a storm and made a promise he had no business being able to keep. And kept it. That was the thing nobody could legislate or manufacture or replicate by design. Not the documentation. Not the federal case number. Not the investigators in their good suits flying in from the regional office. The thing that started it, the irreducible, inexplicable thing that started all of it, was a boy who heard a child crying and turned around. Everything else was just what happened because of that. The trial came 14 months after Alden Brennan's amended complaint landed on a desk in Washington. 14 months of depositions and document reviews and the specific grinding patience of a federal investigation that knows it only gets one shot and cannot afford to miss. Clayton Vance was charged with 11 counts: federal fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, the laundering of federal housing funds through a network of developers who kicked money back into campaigns and private accounts with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing it long enough to believe they'd never be caught. The trial lasted 3 months. Gideon testified twice. The first time had been in the preliminary hearings, a closed room, just him and the attorneys and a court reporter whose fingers moved across the keys with the mechanical precision of someone who had heard worse and would hear worse again. That one had been straightforward. What did you hear? When did you hear it? Where were you? Why were you there? He'd answered clearly, calmly, the way Stone had told him to answer. Just tell the truth. Don't add. Don't subtract. Don't interpret. They'll try to make you do all three. Don't. He hadn't. And the preliminary hearing had bound Vance over for trial. The second time had been different. The courtroom was full, press in the back rows, the 47 families scattered throughout the gallery, Stone and the MC sitting together on the left side, arms crossed, faces set. Evelyn in the third row, hands folded in her lap, watching her son with the specific attention of a mother who has learned that the world does not always protect the people she loves and has decided that her attention will have to be enough. Cade was there too, Wren on his lap. She was 3 now, and she'd been told to be quiet, and she was being quiet in the way 3-year-olds are quiet, which is to say she was whispering questions every 45 seconds, and Cade was whispering answers back, with the patience of a man who has learned that fatherhood is mostly about answering the same question 17 different ways until it finally makes sense. Gideon had been sworn in, had taken the witness stand, had looked out at the room and found Evelyn's face and held onto it like an anchor. The prosecutor had walked him through it first. Gentle, building the foundation. Where were you on the night of November 14th? In the stairwell of the county building on Mercer Street. Why were you there? I was homeless. I was cold. The building was warm. What did you hear? 2 men talking. About a housing wait list. About families being removed. About something called clerical corrections. Did you recognize either voice? No. Did you hear any names? Yes. The Brennan family, and a name. Vance, County Commissioner Clayton Vance. What exactly did they say about Commissioner Vance? They said he was covered, that he's always covered, that the audit trail runs clean. And you remembered this conversation 3 weeks later when you were asked about it. Yes. Why? Gideon had looked at the prosecutor, then at the jury. Because when you're homeless, you learn to pay attention, he had said. You learn to remember faces and voices and who's safe and who isn't. You learn to remember everything because your life depends on it. The prosecutor had nodded, had walked him through the rest. The hospital, Wren, the blizzard, the MC. The moment he'd realized that the name he'd heard in the stairwell was the same name these men were using in connection with corruption and buried files and families disappeared from lists. Then the prosecutor had sat down, and Vance's lead attorney had stood up. His name was Thornton, mid-50s, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who made his living making uncomfortable truths disappear. He'd waited until the prosecutor rested. Then he'd stood up and looked at Gideon with the particular smile of a man who believes he's about to dismantle a witness who doesn't know what's coming. Mr. Hayes, Thornton had said, you were homeless when you claimed to have overheard this conversation. Is that correct? I was homeless, Gideon had said. I don't claim to have overheard it. I did overhear it. Forgive me, you did overhear it. Thornton had walked closer to the witness stand. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, when you're homeless, living on the streets, for what was it, 11 days do you eat regularly? No. Do you sleep well? No. Would you say your mental state during that time was stable? The prosecutor had objected. The judge had sustained it, but Thornton had smiled like the objection had proven his point. Let me ask it differently. You were cold, hungry, exhausted, hiding in a stairwell, and in that condition you claim to remember with perfect clarity a conversation you overheard between 2 men you didn't know about topics you didn't understand 3 weeks before you were asked to recall them. Gideon had looked at him. Yes, he'd said. Mr. Hayes, is it possible that in your condition you misheard, misremembered, perhaps even imagined parts of what you think you heard? And Gideon had leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, just present, the way Stone had taught him. Present. Mr. Thornton, he'd said, when you're homeless, you learn to pay attention, because not paying attention gets you hurt. You learn to remember faces, voices, who's safe and who's not. What corner has a police officer at 10 p.m., and what alley has a man who'll take what you have left? He'd paused. You learn to remember everything, because your life depends on it. So yes, I remember that conversation with perfect clarity, not in spite of my condition, because of it. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Thornton had recovered. He'd tried a different angle. Mr. Hayes, you're currently living with Cade Hartwell, the brother of Stone, the president of a motorcycle club, a club that has a vested interest in seeing my client convicted. Is that correct? I live with Cade because he gave me a home after I saved his daughter's life, Gideon had said. And yes, they want to see your client convicted, because your client destroyed families, including mine, including theirs. So you admit you have a bias. I have a stake, Gideon had said. There's a difference. A bias is when you twist the truth to fit what you want. A stake is when you tell the truth because you've lived it. He'd held Thornton's gaze. I lived it. Thornton had stared at him for a moment. Then he'd said, no further questions. And when Gideon had stepped down from the witness stand, he'd walked past the defense table. And for just a second, Clayton Vance had looked at him, not with anger, not with contempt, with the specific recognition of a man who has underestimated someone and knows it. The kind of look that says, "I didn't see you coming." Gideon had walked back to his seat, had sat down next to Evelyn, had felt her hand find his under the armrest and squeeze once, hard. 3 weeks later, the jury had returned guilty verdicts on all 11 counts. Clayton Vance was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The 47 families were formally reinstated to the housing priority list. Alden Brennan got his job back, his certification, an apology that came in writing and was read into the public record. Sloan Calloway was given a commendation by the federal government for her role as a whistleblower in one of the largest housing fraud cases in Montana history. She'd accepted it quietly. And then she'd moved to Seattle and started working for a housing advocacy nonprofit. She sent Gideon a card on his birthday. It said, "Keep turning around." He kept that on his wall. 1 year and 2 months later, on a December afternoon when the Montana sky was the specific blue that comes after a fresh snow, Gideon Hayes stood in the yard of a house he now called home and watched Wren build a snow fort with the concentrated determination of a 3-year-old who has opinions about structural integrity. He was 18 now, just barely. His birthday had been in October, and Evelyn had made him a cake, and Cade had given him a key to the house, and Wren had drawn him a picture of what she said was an angel, but looked more like a very optimistic interpretation of a bird. He kept it on his wall, too. He was enrolled at the University of Montana. Pre-law, full scholarship, the kind that came with the letter that said the scholarship committee had been particularly moved by his personal statement. He hadn't told them about the blizzard in the personal statement. He'd told them about his mother, about the letter, about clerical corrections and the specific violence of systems that decide who matters. He'd told them he wanted to be the kind of lawyer who made sure that didn't happen to someone else. They'd given him the scholarship and a note that said they looked forward to having him. Evelyn was inside, making dinner. She had an apartment now, a real one, not the shelter, not temporary housing, a lease with her name on it, in a kitchen with a window that got good light and a second bedroom that she'd insisted Gideon could use whenever he wanted. Even though he lived with Cade now, she said it was important that he knew he had 2 places, 2 homes. She was running a program now, through Rosa's Resource Center, supporting families navigating the housing system, making sure what had happened to her didn't happen to someone else. She was good at it. People trusted her because she'd been exactly where they were. Alden Brennan was working again. City inspector. Full certification. The kind of reinstatement that came with a formal apology and back pay and a quiet understanding that the city was very interested in making sure he felt valued. He did feel valued, but more than that, he felt vindicated. Carmen had told Gideon that one night when he'd stopped by to drop off some paperwork for Evelyn, she'd said Alden slept better now, that the thing that had been pressing on him for 18 months had lifted, that he laughed again. Now in the December cold, Cade came out the back door with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and handed one to Gideon. "She's been out here for an hour," Cade said, watching Wren. "She's committed," Gideon said. "She gets that from her mother." Cade's voice did something when he said that. Something soft and old and carefully held. Wren's mother had died when Wren was 6 months old. Cade didn't talk about it much. But sometimes he'd say something like that, and Gideon would hear the shape of a grief that had been integrated into the structure of Cade's life. Not gone, just carried. "You doing okay?" Cade asked. "Yeah," Gideon said. "I'm good." "School good?" "School's good." "Your mom good?" "She's great." Cade nodded. They stood there in the cold and drank hot chocolate and watched Wren pack snow with mittened hands. "I got a call from Stone this morning," Cade said. Gideon looked at him. "They want to do a thing at the clubhouse for you. Anniversary thing. 1 year since the blizzard. They don't need to do that." "I know they don't need to," Cade said. "They want to." He paused. "A lot of people want to say thank you for different reasons. Stone, Garrett, church, Rosa, the families, your mom." He paused again. "Me." Gideon was quiet. "You don't have to," Cade said. "If it's too much, if you don't want—" "I'll go," Gideon said. Cade looked at him. "Yeah." Yeah. Wren looked up from her fort. Gideon, come help. Duty calls, Kate said. Gideon handed him the mug and walked over to where Wren was crouched in the snow. What do you need, he asked. More snow, she said. Very serious. We have a lot of snow. Need more. Okay, more snow, got it. He started packing snow onto the fort wall she'd been building. She watched him critically for a moment, then nodded. Good, she said. They worked in silence for a while. Then Wren said, without looking up from her work, Gideon, yeah, you're my brother. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a fact she was confirming for herself. Yeah, Gideon said, I am. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to packing snow. And Gideon Hayes, who had walked 6 miles through a blizzard on a promise he'd made to a dying man who had testified in federal court against a county commissioner who had been destroying families for 15 years, who had been homeless and invisible and scared and alone, and had decided one night in the cold to turn around instead of walking away, knelt in the snow next to a 3-year-old who believed in angels and helped her build a fort. Because some promises you keep, and some you make new, and both matter exactly the same. Inside through the window, Evelyn and Cade were laughing about something. The sound carried through the glass, warm and real and whole. And outside in the December cold, under a sky that was impossibly blue, a boy who had learned what it meant to be seen built a snow fort with his sister. And if you had asked him in that moment if he believed in angels, he would have said yes. Not because of wings or halos or divine intervention, but because he had learned that angels are just people who show up when they don't have to, who open doors in the middle of storms, who make room at tables, who turn around, and that was enough. That was everything.